So recording enabled, great. So this is where we left off in the last class. This is this slide that you can see right now that actually describes the inherent nature. Eventually, it will eventually boil down to concluding that what is our inherent nature of all the accounting elements. We have 6 elements identified over here. We started with the basic accounting equation: assets equals equity plus liabilities, right? Then we spread the term, we expanded it into its sub-components. Equity means capital plus profit minus drawings. Equity generally, just for a quick revision sake, equity generally means what you owe back to your owner. If you are the business entity, what you owe back to your owner is what we term as equity for now. Equity has a more refined way of describing itself, but for now, you can take equity as what the business entity, that is you, what you owe back to your owner. So what you owe back to your owner is what the owner invested initially in the business. We call it capital. Then whatever profit that you make, you also owe it back to your owner. So that's why we have this positive sign, plus sign here, right? So this is what you owe to your owner, plus this is what additionally you're obliged to give back to the owner. That's an added obligation here. And your obligations decrease because of this factor called drawings. Drawings is what the owner takes away from you. So when the owner takes away any existing resource from you, then your liability or your obligation towards your owner goes down, and hence this negative sign here. So this is how we expand the term equity. The initial contributions by the owner, which makes you owe him or her more. The additional profit that you make out of your operations, that it also makes you owe more to your owner. And the withdrawals made by the owner, which makes you owe less to your owner. And owing less to your owner is signified here with the negative sign. Owing more to your owner is signified here as a positive sign. And then the next step, we take the drawings on over to the other side here, and now our accounting equation becomes assets plus drawings. Minal was dropped. Okay. So assets plus drawings equals capital plus profit plus liabilities. This is the same equation as we have seen here in the second step. The third step is simply taking drawings over to the other side of the equation, right? And then we further expanded this next term, profit. What do we mean by profit? Profit means your revenues or your incomes subtracted your expenditures or day-to-day job expenses in karte. So your revenues minus your expenses is what we will call the term profit. And the profit here now has been divided into its sub-elements. So now your accounting equation becomes assets plus drawings equals capital plus profit को हमने अब define किया as revenues minus expenses. Revenues is another term for incomes. So capital plus incomes minus expenses plus liabilities. That's what your new form of accounting equation. And now finally we have this negative element here, expenses. We will move on to the other side of the equation, and that will give us the final shape of our accounting equation: assets plus drawings plus expenses, and capital plus revenues plus liabilities. And that is what helps us. This new form of the existing accounting equation. We started with a simpler accounting equation here, and we arrived at assets plus drawings plus expenses, capital plus revenues plus liabilities. This particular transformation of the existing accounting equation gives us the idea that these three are similar in nature. So then we finally named that nature. We sort of assigned a term to this nature, that we say that assets, drawings, and expenses have an inherent nature or default nature of being debit, and capital and revenues and liabilities, they have an inherent nature of being credit, right? And we also discussed that debit and credit, these are the terms derived from the हिस्टोरिकल लैटिन लैंग्वेज जब हम रेनेसांस पीरियड के अंदर सिटी स्टेट्स डेवलप हो रही थी, वहाँ पे बिजनेस डेवलप हो रहे थे, तो लैटिन यूज टू बी द लैंग्वेज ऑफ बिजनेस. सो लैटिन लैंग्वेज में डेबिट और क्रेडिट सिंपली मीन्स लेफ्ट एंड राइट, which is where we started off here. So debit simply means left and credit simply means right. So basically, these three items have a left nature or a debit nature to them. Their inherent nature is debit, and these three items, capital, revenues, and liabilities, have an inherent nature of credit. This is just a matter of naming that for later analysis. For the convenience of analysis, we just simply refer to these three items as they carry a default debit nature, and these three items they carry a default credit nature. So then we moved on to this next conclusion. This screen never existed before, so I just made it for simpler understanding. So now we know that assets, drawings, and expenses, since they exist on the left hand side of the accounting equation, so they are supposed to have a default inherent nature of being debit. And capital, revenues, and liabilities, they exist on the right hand side of the accounting equation, and that is how we symbolize them as carrying an inherent nature of being a credit balance. And then we derived further mathematical rules. We call them the double entry rules. We derived the further mathematical rules that if something inherently is debit, और किसी ट्रांजैक्शन की वजह से वहाँ पर एक उस पर्टिकुलर आइटम के अंदर अगर कोई इंक्रीज होता है और वो इनहेरेंटली डेबिट है, दैट मीन्स डेबिट further debiting that item is going to record that effect. So if something is inherently debit, an increase in that item will be further debited, or a decrease in the very same item will be credited. Debits and credits are opposites of each other. So debits and credits, they cancel out each other. So like items जो हैं वो contribute करती हैं एक दूसरे में, and unlike items they will cancel out the effect of each other. जैसे plus और minus signs mathematics के अंदर they cancel out each other. So a plus quantity and a minus quantity is going to cancel out the effect of each other. But the like natured quantities are always going to contribute towards each other. So if we have minus 2 and minus 3, they will contribute towards each other and become minus 5. Similarly, if we have plus 2 and plus 6, the both quantities are like natured, and that is why they will contribute with each other and then contribute towards each other, and then they are going to become plus 8. So the same principle, mathematical principle applies here. If inherently something is debit and it is further debited, that means it is that particular quantity is increasing. But if something is debit and it is decreasing, then a credit effect will record that impact. Similarly, if something has a credit nature inherently and that quantity increases, then we have to further credit it. And if something is out of these three items, if something is decreasing, then we will have to debit that quantity to record that decrease. And then we discussed some examples afterwards that how do we do this. So far we understand the nature of debits and credits. We have okay. Give me a green check if we have no issues with understanding debits and credits. Iman Badar, good. All. Minal Azim is a new student and Mehreen Pervez also a new. Misha, we understand better? Okay, Mehreen understands. Mehreen, have you done any accounting before? Mehreen and Minal Azim. आप दोनों आज पहली बार क्लास में आए हैं कि आपने पहले ओ लेवल अकाउंटिंग की हुई है और या कोई किसी और I'm sorry, Mehreen, your voice was really breaking up. What can you come again? Acha, Mehreen has done before. And Minal Azim, how about you, bete? Have you done accounting before, or this is your first ever exposure to the subject? Minal Azim, can you hear me? Okay. Minal probably cannot hear me. Minal Azim. Minal Iqbal can, but uh, Minal Azim, I cannot, I could not hear you. Your voice was breaking down. So can you write it in the chat box, Minal? Minal Azim, that anyway, probably. Anyway, so basically now if we want to see the effects of debit, what does the debit mean? Remember the most common misconception about debit is that debit means an increase. Debit doesn't mean increase. Debit sometimes means increase. Debit means an increase only if we are referring to these three items. So that means if your assets, drawings, or expenses because of a transaction, if these three increase, only then debit means increase, right? However, debit means decrease if capital, revenues, and liabilities are in consideration. Sophia Numan. This is a new name. I don't know. So basically, we can see that debit, this is what debit actually means, right? So debit means either an increase in the assets, drawings, and expenses, or decrease in the capital, revenues, and liabilities. This is what the debit's true meaning is. So every time we use the term debit, that means either assets, drawings, or expenses are increasing, depending on the nature of the transaction. Either these three items are increasing, or the other three items are decreasing, which exist on the right side of the equation: capital, revenues, or liabilities. Similarly, credit means either your assets, drawings, and expenses are decreasing, or your capital, revenues, and liabilities are increasing. So that is when we use credit. अभी चूंकि हम पहला बिल्कुल बेसिक्स के ऊपर हैं, so you can फिलहाल you can ignore these two elements here because we are going to introduce these two elements later on in chapter number 3 and chapter number 4, right? So for now, you can say that your debit means increase in the asset or increase in the drawings, that is your debit, or decrease in your capital or liabilities. Yani debit means decrease in the obligation or increase in the assets. So do we understand the meaning of debit? Debit means either your assets are increasing or your obligations are decreasing. This is what debit means, right? And that is why I have color coded it in green, because in this case, it's like sort of happening in our favor. So every time something favorable for the business entity happens, we debit it. So what is favorable in this case? That your assets are increasing or your obligations are decreasing, right? And credit is exactly opposite to that. Credit is either your assets go down or your obligations go up. That is what credit means, right? So we understand the term credit here. Give me a green check if you do and a red cross if you don't. Good, 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 good. Okay. Okay, Mehreen and मिनाल ने तो दे दिया मुझे ग्रीन चेक. मिनाल फिगर्ड इट आउट. मेहरीन, आपके पास पार्टिसिपेंट्स विंडो के अंदर ना नॉन वर्बल फीडबैक दिया हुआ है. सो वहाँ पर आपको येस और नो के बटन्स मिलेंगे. सो यू कैन very conveniently give me the green check, and that also helps me to know कि किसको समझ आ गया किसको नहीं है, because I can see that participants window right in front. Okay, so let's move on to this. Then we finally discussed these examples one by one. We are going to discuss these examples. So the first transaction is that the owner started the business by investing $50,000 in cash. And now we know that debit ka matlab kya hai? Debit means either assets are increasing, either increase in assets. Debit means increase in assets or decrease in obligations. This is what debit means for now. Remember, these terms, they are ever evolving as we move to our next chapter and the chapter afterwards, we are going to the debit. The meaning of debit keeps on evolving as we move through the syllabus topics. So debit, from our previous conversation, that we know that debit means either an increase in the assets or decrease in the obligation. And credit is exactly otherwise. Credit is either decrease in the assets or increase in the obligations. So we are going to go with deal with these examples one by one, and then we will see how we break down a regular transaction into its significant parts. And the significant parts का मतलब यहाँ पर है that we will break it down into a debit and a credit entry. So the first transaction is the owner started the business by investing $50,000 cash, right? So the owner started the business by investing $50,000 cash. So we can see that there is the two significant parts over here. So there is an effect on the obligation towards the owner, and there is an effect on your existing cash. So cash is an asset, and cash is increasing for you. You will always consider yourself as the business entity. So अगर आपका owner आपको cash provide कर रहा है, so you're gaining in cash, you're gaining in an asset. So gain in an asset here, this here, gain in the asset is the debit effect. So you can see what we will use in the debit column is the cash. That debit will go to the cash account for $50,000. That our cash asset is increasing by $50,000, and you can see the reasoning underneath that why did we debit cash? We debit the cash because this particular entry is representing increase in the asset. And which asset? We have named the asset over here. And we are going to credit the capital account here. The capital will be credited with $50,000. Capital is what we owe back to our owner, like the equity. And that why are we crediting capital? Because this represents increase in our obligations. And that is why we chose to credit the capital with $50,000. We understand the first entry here, then please give me a green check on the participants window. Yes, Amal, I will be sharing the answers to whatever I share on Google Classroom. I will always share the answers once we have done with that. I plan to do the entire thing in the class. So I will be sharing the answers anyway for your archives later on. You can always refer back after 6 months or 8 months. You can always come back and you can always have your archive organized with all the answers given separately and worksheets being grouped separately. So don't worry about it. I will. Okay, so we all understand. Excellent. Now you are going to solve the next transaction one by one. The next transaction is bought a vehicle paying by cash $6,000. You need to break it down into a debit part and a credit part based on the guidelines that we have derived earlier from the mathematical rules of the accounting equation. So write your answer in the chat box. What do you think should be debited? Use DR for debit and CR for credit. So in this transaction, if we have to break it down into a debit and a credit component, what do you think? What should be debited and what to credit? Write in the chat box. I'm looking at the chat box right now for your answer. So don't worry if you are going to, even if you go wrong, so don't worry about it, then we will fix it. So Madiha says vehicle is debited and cash is credited. Okay, Alicia's Azim says, okay, assets 9, okay, asset vehicle. I think 90 over here means probably brackets. Debit, okay. Asma, you can't have just one debit, you have to have two debits. Okay. Cash is credit, Asma ने बाद में लिख दिया. ठीक है, debit vehicle, but I'm not sure about the credit, Misha. Okay, what do we mean by credit here? What do we mean by credit? Either your assets are going down or your obligations are going up. So when you buy a motor vehicle paying by cash, so you need to first identify the two significant portions here. So let me underline green and let me underline cash with orange. Green over here means you're gaining in an asset, right? So vehicles $6,000 is going to be debit because you're gaining in an asset, and when we gain in assets, that is how we define the debit. So a debit means either increase in the assets or decrease in the obligations, right? And what is the downside in this case? Remember हमने upside or downside भी किया था. So इस case में the upside was that you were getting vehicles and increase in the asset. The orange underline over here is the downside here. You're losing cash. So that means the cash $6,000 is decreasing, and we know decrease in the asset credit here means either assets go down or your obligations go up. So that is how we associate credit effect with the parts of the transactions. So in this case, one asset is increasing and the other asset is decreasing. So the increase in the asset is going to be debited and decrease in the asset is going to be credited, right? Do we understand this, Misha? Okay, great. Misha understood. ठीक है, great. ठीक है. Anyone else having trouble understanding this part? Give me a red mark or okay, Minal understood. Great. ठीक है. Okay, so we move on now. The next transaction is that we bought machinery on credit from XYZ Limited. We know the term, this particular credit is not to be confused with this credit. This is the credit we use to describe the effect of a transaction, but this credit over here is used to describe the nature of the transaction. कि ये आपने simply, it means that the cash was not paid or received. This particular credit means that we have bought something and we have not given the cash or we have not settled our debt yet. So, okay, now break it down. What to debit? Okay, let's go with the debit entry first. Just identify the debit here. Okay, write your answer in the chat box. Machinery says, Alicia says, Asma says. Okay, everyone is great, great, because yes, that is the correct answer. Machinery $10,000 is going to be debited, and that's obvious because our asset called machinery is increasing here. So I'm going to underline this with green. The greens are going to be debit and the oranges are going to be credit, right? So now comes the credit part. What to do, what to credit here? Misha says machinery is debit, 10K and 10K is credit. No, 10K is the amount involved. Machinery is debited with 10K and something else has to be credited with 10K. What is that something else? Madiha Shazad, Mehreen Pervez, very good. Amal Mariam, credit is the creditor. CR is credit, Iman, yes, CR means credit, right? So XYZ Limited is going to be the correct answer. Credit is going to go to XYZ Limited. As you can see now on the screen, why are we crediting XYZ? Because our obligation is increasing towards XYZ Limited. In this case, XYZ Limited is a person we owe. And a person we owe is what we call a creditor, right? But in this case, we will be very specific because creditor is again a very general way of describing someone we owe. But in this case, since we have a proper noun inserted over here, that is XYZ Limited. So in accounting transaction, when you come to recording part, you try to be as specific as possible. So हमने ये नहीं लिखा कि increase in the asset debit $10,000. We refer to which particular asset was debited. So in this case, it was machinery. Similarly, increase in the obligation is going to be credited in this case, but which obligation? You have to name the obligation here. So the correct description of this event should be XYZ Limited credit. We agree with this transaction. Please give me a green check or a red cross if you don't. Good. Amal, we understand? Excellent. Amna Kashrif, Iman Farooq, we understand? Amna Kashrif. आमना काशिफ को मेरे ख्याल आवाज़ नहीं जा रही, नहीं आ गई. ओके ग्रेट, ठीक है, excellent. Now we move on to the next transaction. The owner withdrew $1,000 cash for personal use. Okay, so this transaction is also affecting your assets and or your obligations here. Yes, Minal, you have a question? Minal Azim, you have a hand raise? Okay, maybe it must be a mistake then. Acha. The owner withdrew $1,000 cash for personal use. So what are we going to debit? Just the debit entry first, right? Mahin और मदीहा ने पूरी लिख दी है, ठीक है? Just the debit entry. Just tell me the debit entry. What to debit? ठीक है. Debit means either an increase in the asset or a decrease in the obligation. So what do you think? In इसमें increase in the asset हो रहा है या decrease in the obligation? Because that is the effect we will assign with the debit. So in this case, yes, most of you are correct. Owner, Asma, is again a very general way of describing stuff. We need to be specific. We know that owner से related two terms हम use करते हैं. जब owner contribute करता है, we use the term capital. When the owner takes away something, we use the term drawings, right? Owner by himself or herself is just a reflection of capital, profits, and drawings in accounting, nothing more, right? So yes, drawings is the correct answer. Drawings account $1,000 is going to be debited. Why are we debiting drawings? Because drawings debit represents decrease in our obligation. Obligation towards whom? Obligation towards our owner, right? Now we come to the credit part. What to credit? Alicia says decrease in the cash is credited. Very good. Anyone else? Capital, Mehreen says drawings debit and capital credit. Remember, Mehreen, drawings is a part of the capital. So drawing is being debited. The other effect, credit effect, is either because you are losing your obligation or you're gaining in your asset. So credit का मतलब आपने हमेशा ज़हन में रखना है. Credit का मतलब है either of the two, right? Either it means decrease in the asset or increase in the obligation. So in this particular transactions perspective, what do you think credit can be expressed in the best way? Are we gaining an obligation? No, we are not gaining an obligation in this case, obviously, because we have already seen we are losing an obligation here, right? So credit means in this case, decrease in the assets. So can you spot the asset over here, which we are losing? This is the asset that we are losing here, cash. So the correct answer here will be cash $1,000 decrease. That's how this particular entry is going to be broken down into its double entry section, double entry parts. So if we agree this last entry, give me a green check, all of you. Even if you have made a mistake in the text box, doesn't matter, as long as when I reveal the answer and you understand the answer and you understand the reasoning behind that. That is the most important part. Don't just debit or credit things because you've done that in O levels and this is how you do it. You need to understand the reason why something is being debited and why something is being credited. Okay, Minal Iqbal, we understand better? Everyone else does. They have shown their checks. Good. Excellent. Now, last transaction on this examples list. We repaid XYZ Limited $5,000 by check. This XYZ Limited. This transaction here earlier on where we bought machinery from XYZ Limited for $10,000. Out of that $10,000, अब हम उनको $5,000 repay कर रहे हैं. So now first just the debit part. Only the debit part. What do you think debit is? In this case, we know, again, we'll refer to what debit means. Debit could either mean an increase in the asset or it could mean a decrease in the obligation. So which of the two scenarios is more relevant to this transaction here? So this is how your thought process should go. And now let's see your answers in the chat box. What to debit? Minal says debit XYZ because decrease in the obligation. Excellent. Minal says XYZ. Everyone is, yes, Marine, very good. XYZ, Amal. Very nice, very nice, very nice. Madiha, Alina Sayed, Alina Sayed, वो पिछले question का answer था. Okay, great. So we all agree, excellent. We all agree that XYZ Limited is going to be debited with $5,000. And the reasoning behind that is that this debit entry of XYZ Limited means that you now owe less to XYZ. XYZ was your creditor, your liability, your obligation. So by paying off part of this obligation, now you owe less. That's why you're going to debit XYZ Limited. And now the credit part. Amal says cash in bank, decrease in cash. Madhya says cash at bank. Minal says bank, decrease in the assets. Minal, Azim, thank you. Maheen, Marceline, cash and bank credit 15. Amna Kashif, bank. Excellent, excellent. Everyone is very good, very good. We're getting now used to it. Bank, $5,000. Credit is the correct answer. And the reason behind that is the decrease in the asset because we are losing money from our bank account balance. So $5,000 is decreasing the asset, and that's why out of the two definitions, out of the two explanations of a credit, the first one is applicable here because we are losing an asset. Okay, so now before we move on to the exercises, is there anything on this slide that you did not understand? Anything on this slide? If you understand everything, then green check, last green check here. Okay, and if you have a pending problem or if you have some doubts, any element of doubts on the screen, then give me a red cross on the participants list. All agree except for Minal. Alina Vakas, please ask Alina. Very good. Alina?
Sir, I had a question regarding the last example.
Last one, okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
So it says that we repaid through check.
yeah.
Now, if we don't look at the assets and obligation factor, if you look at the fact that repaying check is an expense, wouldn't we say that our expenses are increasing and hence it should be debited when we're looking at the entire equation?
All right. Okay. When we move on to chapter number 4, where we are going to formally introduce ourselves with the expenses, then we are going to revisit the duality again, dual aspects again. Just to answer that question, this is an excellent question. I'm very glad that somebody got the insight. Okay, anyone want to have a go on that query Alina has placed here? Alina का question यहाँ पे simply ये है कि in the previous slide, let me just get rid of this slide. In this previous slide here, the previous slide, this one, we defined that these expenses, since they share the same inherent nature with drawings and assets, since they also happen to be appearing on the left hand side of this equation. So all of these things have the same inherent nature, and that is debit. And then debit means increase in the assets, increase in the expenses, and increase in the drawings. This is what debit means. And this last transaction here, Alina says that ये जो हम amount pay कर रहे हैं $5,000 का XYZ को, isn't that an expenditure for us because we're spending $5,000? Isn't that an expenditure over here, right? So Alina has asked a very troublesome question. Does anyone have O-level accounting students, especially the ones who have done their O-level accounting? That's a question for them. Does anyone have an explanation of what we mean by here, then asset and expenses? Remember, assets का मतलब क्या है? Assets are also your expenditures, aren't they? When you buy a vehicle or buy plant and machinery or buy land and building, these are all your assets. And all these assets, don't they represent an expenditure by themselves? So is the case with expenses. So I'm going to clear all the feedback over here. If anyone wants to describe the difference over here, O-level accounting students is my primary audience here because they already know about this stuff in a very specific chapter in O-level accounting. There is one whole chapter dedicated to this discussion. What is the difference between assets and expenses? Right now, Alina ने जो question raise किया, Alina is confusing an asset expenditure with a regular expense, right? So this confusion is going to be sorted in chapter number 4 and then later on in chapter number 11. But O-level accounting students have already done that chapter in their O-level. So can any O-level accounting student over here can identify what mistake Alina is making right now? Alina has raised a very valid point here, but that point has a problem in it. I will explain.
Could I just guess?
Yeah, Amal, go ahead.
I think that could you go back to the 6th slide, the last one?
Okay, here you go.
Yeah. So we're for the last example, the transaction, we're basically repaying XYZ Limited. So we're repaying a loan.
Excellent.
It would be an expense, I think, if we were buying something, I'm guessing. But in this case, we're not really buying anything. We're just
Anything
like
at all?
returning the money, and we're not getting anything in return. We're just decreasing
Excellent.
our obligation. That's why
Excellent.
I think it's a credit. And in
Perfect.
case like if we were like paying by check and buying something for $5,000, then it would be a debit.
Perfect, Amal. I
I'm
am
just saying.
I'm so very glad. Amal, you haven't done your O-level accounting before, right? You're doing
No,
it,
I haven't.
and that is why I understand because you have actually came up with a very out of the box answer to this thing. Alina, did you understand Amal's answer? Should I explain it to you, or
Yes,
did you get
sir.
it? Because
No, I
right now,
understood, but the thing is, if we take another example, for example, bought a vehicle paying by cash 6,000.
yeah,
So even there, we wrote decrease in assets for credited. So this
absolutely.
again poses the same question.
You actually took my words. मेरा next question अमल के साथ यही था कि the explanation that Amal has given. What about this transaction? Then Alina's question still remains valid here. Then why isn't that an expense here? We are buying a vehicle, paying by cash. So ये expenditure नहीं है. Of course, ये भी expenditure है, but we ignored the expenditure nature and we only considered the assets change in the asset, increase in the assets and decrease in the assets. That's very good. I'm really enjoying this debate now. So basically, Alina, let me explain what Amal answered before because Amal's answer is also very, very important to understand. Amal says that an expenditure over here, in her opinion, an expenditure always means something that you acquire in return. An expenditure won't be an expenditure unless you gain something in return. So over here, Amal says that this cannot be treated as an expenditure here because you're not gaining anything in return. You are actually just discharging your previous liability. That's why it should not be considered as an expense here. So
Sir,
yeah, Alicia, go ahead.
I think I have another theory.
Excellent.
That maybe expenses are something tangible that you can like. Or sorry, expenses are intangible,
Intangible,
and assets are tangible, like a vehicle.
Oh, okay. So another point of view, very interesting point of view, and very valid as well. Right, you're right. Okay. So there is. I'm very happy. I'm really going to enjoy this class because all of these have specific accounting chapters dedicated, and you already are there. Alina, आपने O level accounting की हुई है पहले या sorry, Alicia ने आंसर किया था अभी या I forgot. Iman ne answer? Alicia ne. It was Alicia. Sorry, I lost track.
I haven't done.
You haven't done. See, all these questions I expect from the people who have not done accounting before. Because accounting जिन बच्चों ने पहले पढ़ी हुई है खैर ये वाला पार्ट जो आपने रेस किया वो तो उन बच्चों ने उन्होंने भी पढ़ी होगी. There is a separate section of accounting, a small chapter, 3 chapters rather, to a small topic which consists of 3 chapters, which discusses the same this issue, the tangibility, that how do we recognize an expense, whether it's how do we recognize an asset from an expenditure. By the way, जो मैं O level accounting वालों से question पूछ रहा था, any O level accounting मैं अभी आपके सारों के points अभी करता हूँ. मदीहा ने कुछ mention किया है नीचे chat में. Madiha says expenses are only short term and day to day while assets are long term and short term. Madiha, you have done your O level accounting because this is the explanation. Madiha has just wrote something in chat box. I want you all to read through it. And O level accounting students, can you name that chapter where you draw this conclusion here? If not, then I will. Maybe I should because we're going to lose time very quickly. The chapter that we are referring to is called Capital and Revenue Expenditures. This is the topic which will sort this issue out once and for all. Alina, आपने जो question raise किया ना expense का, the expenses are of 2 types. You are going to see it in chapter 11 of the book when we have that book, whenever I hope that we all get buy the book very soon. So when we go through that chapter, then sorry, then you see that expenses and assets and drawings, we know they share the same combination debit. Why? Because all of these 3 activities end up losing certain fund of yours. If you are the business entity, you will lose your existing funds because of these 3 reasons. those funds will be either spent on buying the assets or paying for your expenses, or the owner will take away those those funds away from you by way of drawings. That's why these three have the same inherent nature of being debit, because all of these three, they represent your spendings, your application of funds. So all these have the same nature, spending. And Alina raised, how is this type of spending different from this type of spending? And Madiha answered here in the chat box that your expenses, when we are going to define formally expenses hote kya hain, when we define them formally, then we will define that the expenses are usually represents immaterial services. Somebody mentioned the tangibility point of view as well. I think it was Alicia. So expenses usually represent acquisition or purchase of immaterial services, and that happens very frequently on a day-to-day basis in a business environment, like what Madiha has mentioned in the text box here. So एक्सपेंसेस की एग्जांपल है, रेंट आप पे कर रहे हैं, आप अपने हीटिंग एंड लाइटिंग के बिल्स पे कर रहे हैं, आप अपने एम्प्लॉयज़ की सैलरीज पे कर रहे हैं. दीज आर द अमाउंट दैट यू पे बैक in order to buy the services, intangible services. Although tangibility is going to have another chapter discussion. For example, O-level accounting students are familiar with the term goodwill. Goodwill is something intangible and it will be treated as assets over here. So right now you can say that assets are more tangible in nature. They have a physical existence. ये ऐसी spendings हैं जो आपको जो एक tangible material item को represent कर रही हैं, assets, whereas expenses are intangible, immaterial services. So all of these spendings, they have this common nature that they all represent the application of existing funds. However, the spendings towards assets are more tangible in nature, like motor vehicle, like land and building, furniture, fixtures, they have a physical existence. Whereas spendings towards expenses is more intangible in nature, like rent, like electricity bills, like salaries of the employees, etc. So we understand the difference between assets and expenses. This is very basic understanding right now. Remember that. We are going to define it in a lot more detail than this. So please give me a green check if we understand the difference between expenditure on assets and an expenditure on what we call revenue expenses. Capital expenditures and revenue. These are what we call capital expenditures. And these are what we call revenue expenditures. We will have a formal definition for these two coming up in chapter number 11 later on. Okay, Amal, nahi samajh aaya beta? Alicia, nahi samajh aaya? Alina Sayed? Because I'm so very happy that all of your answers, they actually contributed towards the final conclusion that we will draw in a chapter which is far ahead in future, which is introduced to the students who have a very good understanding of the subject. उस वक्त तक नहीं हम उसको introduce करते इन चीज़ों को, जब तक आपकी जो foundation है वो strong ना हो जाए. So you guys are already there. So Asma has posted a question here. Asma says, sir, in the second last example, the owner withdrawing money, so shouldn't there be a decrease in the capital rather than the asset? Very good question again. Okay, people, please answer Asma's question. Anyone can anybody answer Asma's question here? Asma says in the second last transaction, this transaction here, the owner withdrew $1,000 cash for personal use and we debited drawings account. Asma's question here is that shouldn't we debit the capital account here, right? Shouldn't there be a decrease in the capital rather than the assets? Yes. Asma, assets to decrease kar rahe hain, there is no doubt about it. You can't really say कि cash आप lose नहीं कर रहे, because अगर owner ने आपसे cash withdraw कर लिया है, then obviously you're losing cash. So you cannot change this fact. What makes your query valid is, shouldn't we have capital account instead of drawings account debit here? That is your question. Okay? Because we cannot really question here कि cash को credit होना चाहिए 1000 से, asset तो decrease कर ही रहा है, ये तो आप ignore नहीं कर सकते. But decrease in obligation is the explanation used here for the debit part. So capital is your obligation towards your owner. Shouldn't we use capital account over here? So any O-level accounting student want to answer this question? Why did we debit drawings account here? Why did we not use the capital account here instead of drawings? Yes, somebody was answering. I'm sorry, I interrupted. Come again.
I think that, but when we discuss the definition of equity, equity means like drawings and capital.
Excellent,
So drawings
Amal.
is separate from capital.
Excellent, Amal.
And in this case, like even if the owner is withdrawing money, that doesn't mean that we owe him anything less.
Bilkul.
That capital like still remains. We still owe him the money that we owe him.
Excellent, Amal. I agree to Amal's answer 90 to a degree of 90%. Amal made a small mistake in her description. Let me go back to that slide here. So you see the term equity, the description of term equity. You understand, you've done maths at some level. You understand the universal set and the subset concept here. So basically, your equity is the universal set here. Equity is the overall set, and that element represents the set. Equity set represents whatever you owe to your owner, and then that set of that universal set has three sub explanations. कि what do you truly owe? अगर आपने ये देखना है कि आप अपने ओनर को क्या owe करते हैं, then you have to be specific. Remember, at some point in this explanation, I said कि okay, fine, we understand the overall concept, but as far we need when it comes to recording the transactions, you have to be as specific as possible. If there is a proper noun used, you will use the proper noun. If the proper noun doesn't exist, then you will use a common noun. If the common noun doesn't exist, then you will use the generic description, the universal set by at all. So in this case, if you see your equity, as Amal mentions here, the equity over here is three parts. Equity means what you owe to your owner. And what do you owe to your owner? Capital represents contributions. So you will use the term capital every time owner contributes towards you. You're the business entity. And what does the drawings mean here? Drawings means withdrawals. So all of these three are a part of your equity. They are all a part of the same thing. Amal said, "एक point पे drawings is separate from capital. In a sense, it is, but they are together in one universal set called the term equity here, right? So drawings is the term we use. Drawings is capital, by the way. Drawings is a subset of capital. Capital means positive contributions. Drawings means negative contribution, right? So drawings is the term that we use only to reflect what the owner has taken away from you, and capital is the term we use when the owner contributes something towards you. Remember, in this slide here, even if we wrote capital account here instead of drawings, it wouldn't be wrong. The examiner is bound to give you credit for this. This is not an error. Although this is not the most desirable way of describing this transaction. For example, अगर आपका मैं ये टेस्ट लेता और आप में से किसी ने capital account debit किया होता instead of drawings account, I would have given you 100% credit. Even though there is a better expression than capital over here, because we know capital is an overall description. The more specific description over here is drawings. And that is why the student who uses the term drawings is going to produce a more desirable answer. Capital is also a correct answer, but not as desirable as drawings. So we understand this part? Understood. Thank you, Asma. Thank you. Let me get rid of this. Delete. Let me get rid of these annotations over here before they get printed. Oops. So I'll figure it out. Erase. Where is the eraser? So now let's, if you have the book, Acha, how many of us did not buy the book yet? The book that I shared on Google Classroom and on WhatsApp group. How many of us don't have that book right now? Can you give me a green, sorry, not green, the red mark. If you don't have the book, give me a red mark, please. ठीक है. So we have 3. Okay, बच्चों आपने ज़रूर वो लेनी है क्योंकि फिर हम आगे काम नहीं शुरू कर सकते. फिलहाल then I am going to go back to the same worksheet that I shared on Google Classroom. ठीक है. So you have 5 minutes doing 2.1 on your own. अपनी notebooks का आंसर लिख लें, and then I will call out the debits and credit entries one by one. ठीक है. जिन बच्चों ने अभी तक बुक नहीं खरीदी हुई, मैं आज फिर से एक बार शेयर कर दूंगा उसका कवर. Please get it. Try to get that book as early as possible. Right now, we will continue to use the same worksheet. Remember, the worksheet that I shared is almost exactly the same as the exercise questions you will find on your on that book. So 2.1 is a similar looking situation. You have to identify the account to be debited and account to be credited. Account is simply a term that describes a specific element of transaction जिनको आपको debit या credit करना होता है. So we will do this in the next 5 minutes. There is a transaction B. Okay, you can carry on with your work, but let's discuss transaction B in the chat box. Anyone figures out what transaction B means, आप अपनी notebook पे लिख रहे हैं, आप लिखते जाएं, लेकिन जो भी अपना transaction B का आंसर निकालेगा, वो chat box में भी लिख दे ताकि मुझे साथ साथ पता लगता रहे, right? I want to see how you solve transaction B. बाकी की सारी transactions are very simple. Transaction B is a troublesome one. So let me make it bigger. You can see the worksheet clearly. वैसे मैंने ये आपको Google Classroom में miscellaneous worksheets के अंदर post कर दी हुई है. Marine has posted her answer. We will discuss the answer in a bit. पहले आप अपना पूरा question attempt कर लें before the lesson finishes. ठीक है. Asma, very good. I think capital credit. अभी हम Asma discuss करते हैं बिल्कुल. You can also see the feedback from your friends in the chat. Capital increases credit, C. John's debit, Maheen Marceline, very good. Minal Azim has C. John's credit and capital debit. Minal का 2 parts में answer आया है. ठीक है, we will discuss. You just put your answer to transaction B in the chat and carry on with the rest of the question. Jaldi se, within 5 minutes. We have just 10 minutes left in the question. I want to discuss something else before we wind up today's lesson. जल्दी से within the next 5 minutes आप अपना ये question attempt कर लें. ये worksheet Google Classroom में classwork tab के अंदर already पड़ी हुई है. I recommend you download it and we will use this worksheet until all of us have the book. So we have 4 students still not able to buy the book, so they will be able to do that hopefully before the next lesson, which is tomorrow. And once you're done with all the transactions, leave a green check on the participants window so that I know that who's left and who's still doing. Alina Vakas done, Alina Sayyed done. Alina, beta आपको वो समझ आ गई थी ना discussion expense और asset के अंदर difference की. अभी फिलहाल वो एक basic सी चीज़ है distinction के लिए वो आप use करें, but actually there is a way more conceptual way of defining the two separate from each other. There is a separate chapter dedicated to capital expenditures or assets, differentiating assets while expenditure from the everyday expense. And then there is a separate chapter on tangibility of using tangibility as the evidence for identifying whether something should be treated as a regular expense or something should be treated as an asset. वह आगे दो बहुत major topics आएंगे. But for now, we can go with the same basic description that an expense represents usually immaterial services and an asset expenditure represents material acquisition, something tangible. Okay, Alina Vakas is done, Alicia Azim is done, Amal Mariam is finished, as well as Iman and Asma Wasim and Maheen Mursaleen, Nabiha Shahzad, Mehreen, Minal. Very good, very good, good. Okay. Iman Badr, bete, are you done? Done, okay, great. Now, let's discuss the answer to transaction B. And by the way, Maheen का answer, जिन्होंने भी answer post किया था, बिल्कुल ठीक है. Let's dissect this part. So let's identify what is happening in this transaction. बल्कि let me bring back the note here. So the transaction says that the proprietor or the owner, the proprietor is a term that we use to describe the owner. So this is who you are. You're the business entity. You're the business enterprise here. This is who you are. This is your owner. And this is C. Jones, one of your creditors. ये आपका एक creditor है, एक obligation है, एक liability है, right? So you owed owner, you owe owner as well as C. Jones. आपके लिए दोनों obligations हैं. But what is being described in this transaction is that the proprietor, the owner, paid directly to one of your creditors. Now, what is happening over here? One obligation is increase in the obligation, and then there is another obligation which is decreasing. So the increase in the obligation is towards owner because now you owe your owner more, but decrease in the obligation is towards C. Jones because C. Jones को अब आप वो amount owe नहीं करते जो आप पहले owe करते थे. So your obligation, this transaction, if we break it down into a simpler analysis, our simpler analysis simply means कि assets or obligations पे क्या effect हो रहा है. For now, our analysis is just going to restrict to assets and obligations. We haven't really discussed the expenditure part. So in this case, you can simplify this transaction that your obligations towards owner is increasing and your obligation towards C. Jones is decreasing. Why is your obligation towards C. Jones is decreasing? Because C. Jones' debt has been settled. That's why this part is going to be debited, right? Whereas your obligation towards owner is increasing because since the owner has paid C. Jones directly out of your assets from his personal pocket, that means whatever amount that you owed to C. Jones is now you owe to your owner. So that is why the obligation towards owner is increasing. And that is when we use the term capital, not drawings. Remember, owner को आप capital और drawings दोनों से represent कर सकते हैं. But you have to be smart when to use the term capital and when to use the term drawings. You will use the term drawings only when owner withdraws something from you. But you will use the term capital when owner contributes something towards you. So in this case, the journal entry or the double entry should be that we debit the creditor's account. In this case, it's probably C. Jones, right? C. Jones is going to be debited and we credit capital account. So that's how we break it down in this, the transaction B. So whoever got the transaction B correct on their notebooks, please give me a green check here. Or if you got it wrong and you now understand it, then you can give me a green check here. Excellent, excellent, and very good, excellent. So I am going to quickly call out the remaining 4 minutes. मैं बाकी की सारी double entries जितनी भी हैं वो बोल रहा हूँ. आप अपनी notebooks में check करते जाएं. And बल्कि मैं इसके आंसर आपके साथ शेयर कर दूंगा, इस पूरी वर्कशीट का आंसर आपके साथ शेयर कर दूंगा. In that way you will have a record of your own and you will be able to complete your questions later on. So far you're only supposed to do 2.1 and 2.2. Okay, so our time is almost done. We are 3 minutes to go. So this is the time when I ask you to leave if you don't have any questions, pending questions to answer, because I want to save the last 5 minutes कि अगर किसी को कोई specific question पूछना तो मैं पूछ ले. So now we're done with the lesson. 2.1 and 2.2 is what you need to complete before tomorrow's class, right? And now you can leave and move on to your next class. But if you have anything to discuss, then stay back. I'll see you tomorrow. Okay? Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you, Asma. Bye-bye.